Dear students, please note down. The notes of this lecture are available in the description of video. Please download your notes. Dear students, today we will discuss transport of respiratory gases in blood. And it is a common topic for all competitive exams, particularly BSc students, NEET students, civil services students. Transport of gases in body in blood. Dear students, transport of gases occurs in two ways. Transport of oxygen, transport of CO2. First of all, we will discuss transport of oxygen. It occurs in two forms. About 1 to 3% of oxygen gets dissolved in blood plasma. It means about 3% of oxygen gets transported in solution form, in dissolved form via blood plasma. Maximum about 97 to 99% of oxygen that enters in RBCs, erythrocytes. Here in RBCs, the oxygen interacts with hemoglobin molecule and it produces oxyhemoglobin. It means about 97% of oxygen is transported in the form of oxyhemoglobin. Transport of CO2. And transport of CO2 that occurs in three ways. About 7% of CO2 that gets dissolved in blood plasma. As we know, the CO2 is more soluble in blood plasma, in water, as compared to oxygen. About 7% of CO2 gets dissolved in blood plasma. It means about 7% of CO2 is transported in solution form, in dissolved form. Remaining 93% of CO2 enters in RBCs. And here in RBCs, about 23% of CO2, that CO2 interacts with hemoglobin and it produces carboaminohemoglobin. This carboaminohemoglobin, about 23%, is carried via blood to lung alveoli. Remaining 70% means maximum transport of CO2 that occurs in the form of bicarbonate ions. Here in RBCs, this CO2 interacts with water molecule and this reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme that is carbonic anhydrase, which is fastest enzyme. Its turnover number, that is 36 millions. Here this carbonic anhydrase which catalyzes the reaction and it produces carbonic acid H2CO3, which dissociates into H ions and bicarbonate ions. Note down, these bicarbonate ions diffuse out from the RBCs into blood plasma, and here in blood plasma the chloride ions which shift in these RBCs to maintain an ionic equilibrium. This is known as chloride shift. All competitive exam students, please note down very important question, that is chloride shift, or this chloride shift is named as Hamburger's phenomenon. For all students, all competitive exam students, here in RBCs, this CO2 interacts with water molecule in presence of an enzyme that is carbonic anhydrase, which is fastest enzyme. Its turnover number, that is 36 millions. Here this carbonic anhydrase which produce this carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid dissociates into H ions and bicarbonate ions. These bicarbonate ions from these erythrocytes diffuse out in blood plasma, and from blood plasma chloride ions enter in these RBCs. This is chloride shift. This is very important phenomenon. It is Hamburger's phenomenon. Dear students, very clear I think. Transport of oxygen that occurs in two forms. About 3% of oxygen that gets dissolved in blood plasma. It means about 3% of oxygen is carried via blood in the form of solution. Remaining 97% of oxygen that enters in RBC's erythrocytes. Here in these blood cells, this oxygen interacts with hemoglobin to produce oxyhemoglobin, means 97% of oxygen is carried in the form of oxyhemoglobin. And the transport of CO2 that occurs in three ways. About 7% of CO2 that gets dissolved in blood plasma, means 7% of CO2 is transported via blood in the form of solution. Remaining 93% of CO2 that enters in blood cells, erythrocytes. Here in erythrocytes, about 23% of CO2 that interacts with hemoglobin to produce carboaminohemoglobin. 23% of CO2 is transported in the form of carboaminohemoglobin, and the maximum transport of CO2 that occurs in the form of bicarbonate ions. Here in RBCs, this CO2 interacts with water molecules to produce carbonic acid, and the reaction is catalyzed by fastest enzyme, which is carbonic anhydrase. And this carbonic acid, which is unstable, it immediately dissociates into H ions and bicarbonate ions, and these bicarbonate ions diffuse out from these erythrocytes into blood plasma, and from blood plasma the chloride ions enter in these RBCs to maintain an ionic equilibrium, that is chloride shift. This is Hamburger's phenomenon. This diagram shows another important graph, which is oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. This S-shaped, this sigmoid graph, which represents oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. It also shows Bohr's effect and Haldane's effect. Dear students, this is percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, percentage saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin, and this is the partial pressure of oxygen. This is the normal value. This is the normal value of percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen with respect to partial pressure of oxygen. Here the oxygenated blood which leaves the lung alveoli, but in body tissues where metabolism is high, the CO2 concentration is more, body temperature is high, but the pH is less. It means this curve in body tissues shifts to right hand. In body tissues due to increase in concentration of CO2. Here in body tissue the concentration of CO2 increases due to metabolism which is high, body temperature is high, but pH is less. It dissociates oxygen, and this curve shifts to right hand. This is known as right shift, which helps in the release of oxygen. That's why it is named oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And the hemoglobin that shows dual nature. This hemoglobin in lung alveoli which binds oxygen, but in body tissues here the concentration of CO2 is more. So it releases oxygen and it starts to bind CO2. It means in body tissues the pH, the concentration of CO2 which is high, the body temperature which is high, it favors release of dissociation of oxygen and binding of CO2. This is Bohr effect. This curve which is normal value, it shows this green color. This value is normal value. In body tissues, due to increase in CO2 concentration, this curve shifts to right hand. It is right shift. This right shift is Bohr's effect, which helps in the dissociation of oxygen and binding of CO2. But dear students, in lung alveoli, the CO2 concentration is less, temperature is low, and pH is more. It favors binding of oxygen and dissociation of CO2. This is left shift, and this is named as Haldane's effect. These are three shifts. When the chloride ions from blood plasma enter here in RBCs, it is chloride shift. When this graph, this normal value in body tissues due to increase in concentration of CO2, this curve shifts to right hand. It is right shift. It is Bohr effect. But in lung alveoli, the oxygen is more, CO2 concentration is less, and the curve shifts to left. It is left shift, and this shift to left, it is named Haldane's effect. And this left shift, it involves in the binding of oxygen with hemoglobin and dissociation of CO2. Dear students, this is all about transport of respiratory gases in blood. Oxygen about 3% in blood plasma, and the remaining 97% oxygen is carried in RBCs by oxyhemoglobin form. Transport of CO2 that occurs in three ways. About 7% gets dissolved in blood plasma, means 7% in solution form, remaining 23% of CO2 that interacts with hemoglobin to form carboaminohemoglobin, and maximum transport of CO2 about 70% that occurs in bicarbonate ions form. This is oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. These are two values in body tissues when concentration of CO2 is more. Then this curve it shifts to right hand, and in lung alveoli the concentration of oxygen is more, the CO2 concentration is less. This curve shifts to left hand. It is shift to left. It is right shift. This is Bohr effect, and this is Haldane effect, and this chloride shift is Hamburger's phenomenon.